When I started, and I was a teenager, with not much experience in music or musical instruments, there wasn't a lot around in rural Vermont, where I lived. There was, I'd heard of Martin guitars. I had a friend at the commune that I was living at. My mom started a commune and left me and my brother there, essentially. And there was a woman there who had a little Martin guitar that she let me play, a little New Yorker 018, 0018, which was a really great little guitar. And I kind of actually learned playing guitar on that. So that was unusual because I was not aware of any other guitars really in my life prior to that. But there wasn't much else around, and I didn't know anything about instrument building. But there was this guitar that I was learning to play, and then there was another woman at the commune who played banjo. And I just loved the banjo. And here I was 16 years old, and I went into this little high school program in the nearby town. And basically the deal there was the director would try and match up the kids with people in the community to learn trades or whatever. I said, could you find someone to teach me to build a banjo? And I almost can't tell you where that thought came from other than there was this inspiration because I knew this person who played banjo. But they managed to find me a guy who was not a banjo builder, not really an instrument builder. He was an artist, Ken Rippertella. Not that much older than me, but when you're 16 and somebody's a few years older, they can seem like God, so. And he was kind of a wild young guy, made amazing things, Appalachian dulcimers primarily, but just wild sculptures, just amazing free-form, asymmetrical stuff. And he knew basically how to figure out where to put the frets and not much else in terms of technical stuff. And he did most of his carving, sculpting, and they were elaborately sculpted with a drill, an electric drill with a sanding disc on it. And that's kind of what, he didn't use chisel, he didn't, he had a table saw that I was always a little scared when he turned on the table saw that he was going to cut his hands off or something. But he was a great guy, and he kind of took me under his wing. And I spent several years working quite a lot with him, and not making anything of great note, but just kind of messing around. And he spent a lot of time designing. He was an artist from a family of artists, had gone to art school. So that was kind of my initiation into it. And the other thing that he did that was really great was he took me and a bunch of other kids at this funny little school I went to down to New York City a couple of times and took us to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where they have the most fantastic instrument collection. And I was just blown away. That was really probably one of the formative experiences for me, was seeing all these instruments from all different cultures, all different shapes and sizes. And some of them, they even had recordings. You could walk around with headphones on and hear the sounds. And for a hippie kid who'd spent, my entire life in rural Vermont, just kind of being exposed to that was amazing. And so we would go home back to Vermont from these trips, and I would try and build some of these instruments that I'd just seen in this glass cases. They were pretty much all disasters, but that's what I was doing, trying to first figure out how they would work, what they might sound like. And so it was really kind of a free-for-all. It was just a lot of experimenting. And that's probably where my penchant for the asymmetrical and unusual designs comes from. But I knew it wasn't going to hold water in terms of making a living. I just wasn't, I wasn't a great artist at that point, and I didn't have any way to get to making a living from that. And I knew I really wanted to do it. I really wanted to make instruments. And I discovered, amazingly enough, there was a lot of things that just fell into place. And I think in the local health food store, a little flyer for this guy, Charles Fox, who had a little school not that far away from me, it turned out, in southern Vermont, 45 minutes or an hour away. He'd just been doing it for a year, was very new at the school thing, but he had a place where you went and lived for 6 weeks, basically, in a yurt, and had access to his shop, and then built a guitar. And I wrote him a letter and said, gee, I'd can I do that? He called me up almost immediately. Charles is a very forward sort of person. I said, we have an opening in the class for November. Can you come? But the big change was that I had to kind of shrink myself in. I could no longer do this, I'll build anything, I'll design this, this is going to be a 6-string fiddle, I'm going to do Chinese pipa, moon lute. I had to build guitars and figure out how to do it. And the Charles Fox thing was that he's very clear. He's a great teacher. He says, okay, you do it this way, you do this, here's the rules. And he changed the rules all the time, of course. I would go back to subsequent classes to visit, and he would be telling the students, a whole different set of things that they should do. But the basic stuff was there, the basic measurements and the basic ideas. So I learned how to build what would essentially be a kind of Martin dreadnought-ish steel string guitar. Dimensions, bracing, variables that you might need to know. And because I had this other experience and I was so passionate about it, it just sunk in. I just did it, figured it out right away. And that first guitar I made was actually quite a great guitar. Took it home and sold it so that I could get money to make the next one. The other great thing I did was after that experience, I went home and taught my older brother how to build a guitar, which was the best thing I could have done because it cemented those ideas. And I had a notebook. I still have in the other room the blue notebook that I filled every page with notes from Charles Fox's school. And it took about 10 or 15 years before I stopped looking at that notebook every time I built a guitar. And now I don't even think about it. I haven't looked at it for years. But I always wanted to come back around. I always knew I was going to come back around to the place where I was doing this expansive thing again. Starting from art rather than starting from, what do I need to do to build a good guitar? Rather to come back around, I have this great idea for a guitar that looks like a chicken, or something like that. And to be able to just do that and make it work. And so now, 35 years later, I'm at that point, where I basically I'm pretty secure about being able to design a guitar that looks like a chicken and make it work. I'm not sure that's what I want to do, but you get the idea. Along the way, there were some wonderful musicians that really helped me kind of pull all that together, do that. There was a guy at the shop in Vermont. We had a little collective shop, people at this commune that I lived in, and some other local people, and a bunch of instrument builders. I kind of gathered together several instrument building friends, and we had a room about this size. So for a while, we might have had as many as 6 instrument builders doing various stuff in it. A harp builder and a marimba, all sorts of stuff, banjos, fiddles. There was a guy there who came intermittently and built harps. Daniel Hecht was his name. He turned out, he was a great guitarist, and I'd taken my first guitar lessons from him before I'd ever built any instruments. He, it turned out, ended up going on to make a record, very nice record for Windham Hill Records, and became friends with Alex DeGrassi and Michael Hedges and Will Ackerman, that crowd, which a lot of people will be familiar with those names, because that was really kind of the beginning of the blossoming of the American acoustic solo steel string guitar tradition. A lot of people now cite Michael Hedges or Alex DeGrassi or Will Ackerman as inspirations. So there I was, kind of right on the ground floor of that, and Daniel bought a couple instruments from me. Actually, he had a really nice guitar, one of my favorite guitars, built by Urban Samaji, local California builder, which I did some repair on. It was interesting, and Daniel would travel out to the West Coast and then would come back and give me news of builders and people out here. But he was very influential because he was a great guitarist, and really the first guitarist that I ever built instruments for, where he would say, this works, this doesn't work. And then through him, I got to know Alex DeGrassi and became quite good friends with Alex. And Alex, for now, when was it? It's been many years anyway, 20, 25 years. Alex has been kind of a supporter, and when I build some great strange new instrument that I'm not sure what to do with, I'll say, Alex, you want to try this out, and loan it to him for a while, and he'll have some ideas about, maybe the ways the next one could be better. And so we kind of help each other out in that way. He gets to try out these new things, and I get some of his guitarist expertise. So there have been a few people like that. There's another guy, Todd Green, who is a multi-instrumentalist. And the way that he influenced me partly is that he plays instruments from all over the world. He probably has 50 instruments that he plays in his repertoire. Travels all around touring, playing them. And he not only has commissioned me to, I think 4 or 5 instruments that are kind of combinations of various ethnic instruments that he would like to have combined with guitar or something. But also he brings me instruments. I've become kind of his go-to repair person. So he brings me these instruments from all over the world, and I get to see, what these amazing rebobs and rebobs and rebobs, and they all have interesting, unusual names, and a lot of instruments that have skin heads like banjos, bowed instruments, plucked instruments, and it's just been really mind-opening for me to have that experience. So yeah, working with musicians definitely is big, a big part of it. And what I'm doing, much more than what a lot of builders are, most builders, I would certainly say, establish a model, right? You've seen this with Richard Hoover, with just about anybody. Jeff Traugott does this. Even people who are building on a smaller scale still tend to establish 1 or 2 or 3, or maybe more, models, and produce those. And then you jig up to produce those. And then any work that you do for a musician tends to be customizing those models. What I've always done is I've started it from scratch with each musician. Said, okay, what do you want? Here's what I can do. Here's pictures of things I've done. But basically, do you want something big, small, more strings, what kind of sound? And then really, so it's beyond custom in a certain way. Although I also always tell the client that it has to fit my own quirky sense of aesthetics. I have to like it too. It can't just be for them, which sometimes limits my clientele, because understandably a lot of musicians want an instrument that's a tool that's just built for them. And I, because of the sort of artistic upbringing, am always looking for a way to also express myself in the work. It's interesting that now I've come to this point after all these years, 40 some years, where I'm becoming more interested in just simplifying things, and making instruments that are more just simple tools. I don't know if I'll be able to do it, if I can get rid of the wild stuff, but the instrument that I really want for myself, when I sit down to play guitar, I just want a parlor guitar. And I've played music all my life too. There's been a kind of a parallel universe of playing music. When I sit down and play music, mostly I play this 5-string banjo that was a cheap mail order banjo from 1910 or something that I got at a yard sale for $4. That's the instrument I go to, And here I'm making $40,000 39-string harp guitars. But that Bruno banjo, boy, that is the thing. And it's just because it's a tool, and I can sit down with it and not have to think about it and just play. So I appreciate that part of the whole thing, that's on some level, that's what the real musicians, and especially the working musicians, want. They want a tool that's nice and that works for them. And so it's interesting, kind of the push and pull of my life has been honoring that, but then also following this artistic, creative passion that I have that just kind of pours out of me. I can't contain it. So yeah, it really, it's wonderful. And where it's all going, well, I say for me, part of me really is wanting to kind of simplify and make instruments that are more tool-like. On the other hand, I'm right now coming around to wanting to build banjos again, which is when I started out, I wanted to build a banjo, and I never really did it. I built a few, but I never jumped in and just made banjos for a while. So I'm gearing up to do that. I'm working on my first prototype harp banjo, which I keep saying I'm going to keep simple, but you never know. And I don't think there's anybody else making harp banjos at the moment. So so I figure, at least I can corner a market that nobody's interested in, if nothing else. I got, amazingly enough, I started telling my friends and clients that I was building a harp banjo. I have 2 orders already. Nobody even knows what they're going to be. It's one guy called me up the other day and said, well, so how's it coming? I don't even know. I haven't built the prototype yet. So, you just can't, I don't know. But I was going to try and tie this into, what I think we're as a community of musicians and luthiers, is kind of where we're going. What is the state? There's a lot of wonderful interplay between, the factory model and the handmade model. And the 2 lines are kind of blurring, which I think is kind of wonderful. There's still the really cheap instruments made by the really big factories. And there's always going to be a place for that. But there's now so many more sort of, the boutique builders that make, like Santa Cruz Guitar that makes, however many, X 100 or 1,000 guitars a year, but it's not tens of thousands. They make 16 guitars a week or something, whatever it is. So it's a little bit more production, but they're using the hand techniques and hand voicing and making great instruments for prices that are more reasonable than I can do. They're a little more limited in what they can do because they're not starting from scratch each time. They're doing that thing of basing everything on their few models. Still, there's a lot of innovation, but there's that kind of crossover now. There's a lot more stuff that's in the area between individual hand building and big factories, and I think that's really great for the for the whole community, because it provides some room for innovation, but also standards and a kind of a less expensive than if it was just people like me doing it. And I could never keep up with the demand anyway. You really have to. There has to be some mass production. There's just too many people in the world. But I see that. It is amazing how many instrument builders there are now, how many individual luthiers there are. And I'm talking mostly guitar builders, but there's a lot of, there's a lot of other stuff. And there's a lot of influence now. I think there always has been, but I think more and more there's influence kind of crossing over from the different traditions. I've worked with a violin builder now for 30 years, and she has really influenced me. And one of the ways that she's influenced me, and I would like to think that this may be a trend, but I'm not sure it is that the aesthetics of the violin building world are greatly, greatly different from guitar building. Because guitar building in this country, steel string guitar building, which is really the dominant instrument that we're talking about here, is a factory model. Basically, it was largely influenced, and all the hand builders are largely influenced by the factory model, because it was Martin and Gibson and whoever else, but mostly them, that built instruments that we are all emulating when we build traditional steel string guitars. And so everything from the look and the design and the feel and the finish is all kind of based on how the factories built those instruments. The classical guitar tradition is different than that, although it's very influenced by that, because there are efficiencies and considerations that are really guitar building benefits from that factory model. But the violin building tradition is very much one instrument at a time, very handmade. The aesthetic is very different. You want to see tool marks in the instrument. You don't want to see, in a Jeff Traugott guitar, you don't want to see a chisel mark in the top. You want to see that in violins. You want to see, where somebody has scraped the wood. It wants to look like it was made by hand. That is the aesthetic. And that certainly has influenced my life working with a violin builder. And Susie is always saying to me, come on, give it up, stop sanding, use a scraper, and show some marks, make it look like it's made by hand. And we're always trying to make it look like it was made by a factory, because that is the aesthetic that we were given as guitar builders. I think it would be great if we lost that. If we could just get rid of some of that and not worry about trying to look like our instruments were made in factories, because we're not factories. And so I've kind of gone in the other direction greatly, where I'm starting to paint things, and just make things not at all look like they were made in a factory. And I see more of that happening in a way because people need to differentiate themselves. There's so many builders now. People are trying to figure out ways to make what they do be special and different and individual. And I just think that's great. And I think we're going more in that direction. The other thing that I think about a lot in terms of the future, I think there's going to be more of this, more and more of this kind of combining of musicians and luthiers to create things. I see more and more of that, and I think that is fostered by having this great community of individual builders who can work more closely with the individual musicians. One of the things there's been this little blip in the rising up of the renaissance of handmade guitars, where it's really cool to have the most beautiful woods. And that's really the main innovation I think that most builders are doing, is they're using more and more beautiful, fancy woods, and they're getting the best blah-de-blah Lutz spruce, and the Brazilian rosewood and the most amazing figured stuff. Those woods really are not going to last forever. People really need to open up their minds to different woods, different materials even. There's been a little bit of that done, people have worked with graphite and with formica and with some god-awful stuff. And some of it has worked and some of it hasn't, but it's all great. And that really needs to be done. And the thing is that can't just be done by the luthiers. The luthiers really probably have to bite the bullet, and take the risk to do some of that. But the musicians have to be open to it too and be willing to accept it. And well, for me, I'm involved in all that stuff. I'm involved in making many different kinds of instruments. I'm involved with the musicians, and I am a musician. I get my own, I go out and do my own logging a lot get my own wood. Just going to set this up because this is unusual, and this is my thing. I don't think anybody else does it like this. I'm setting up and teaching a little class, and so one of these is mine and one is a student's. But basically this is called the universal work table, and it's got all this stuff is all made, but it's got tracks that the clamps slide in. And what I do is I'll set up a solera, right? So I cut out a piece of masonite that's the same shape as the instrument, and it's shimmed up a little bit, so I get the doming in the top by screwing down the center part. And both classical guitars and steel string guitars tend to have a domed top. I'm building in the classical tradition, so the top is face down on the solera. I brace the top. I put the sides on. I put the back on. I don't have any molds, so these slide around, and I'll get a couple dozen of these all the way around the instrument, and they just slide up and lock in place to create the individual mold for each instrument. And I haven't seen anybody else do this particular thing. It's a little bit similar to the work board, which is cut out like a guitar shape. It has slots in it, and they slide things like this in and out from the sides. I got this idea from listening to a lecture that Jose Romanillos did, and he had little L-shaped things that he slid in and out of slots. And I thought, wow, I could make a big table that had these T-slots in it, and then make these kind of posts and just be able to slide them in anywhere. And it's great. So it takes a lot of setup for each instrument, but it enables me to make each instrument completely from scratch, a new shape. I don't have to depend on molds. That's kind of my main building innovation. Otherwise, I'm mostly just building classical style. And people are kind of always amazed by that. Harry Fleischman always cracks up when we talk about how I'm using classical techniques to build these 39-string harp guitars. And it's just that. That's what works for me. That's what I learned, and it's what I'm comfortable with. So some things I don't change, and then other things I change wildly. Yeah. These are great because there's just so much flexibility. You can move them around. I can take something like this and just make a masonite cutout of it, and I can figure out where the doming I want. It looks like the doming here was right there, and so I'll have that section will be have a void underneath it, and I just screw that down to the workboard to get a doming. And you can adjust the doming for how much tension you want in it, depending on how soft your wood is or how big your instrument is or what kind of sound you're trying to get. So there's a lot of parameters you can control with this. A lot of people these days are just doing their doming. They just have especially in steel string guitars, you just have a dish, right? What they call a radius dish, with whatever it is, 15-foot, 24-foot radius in it. So you have a curve in the dish. And the top just gets pressed down into that, and the braces are fit into that. Then every guitar has that dish. And this is really a different thing. It's more closer to the old classical style, where they would actually have a big hunk of wood and they would carve into the shape of the wood like a workbench, and they would carve a little doming into the shape, and kind of a much more complex shape, and then force the braces into that shape. So when I started out, I was doing lacquer, acrylic lacquer, which is nasty stuff. And then I moved to nitrocellulose lacquer, but I was living in this shop in the commune, living in the shop literally. I had a loft in the upstairs. We had no exhaust fan. I was spraying in the shop, just spraying out a window, and then sleeping, spending 24 hours a day in the fumes. And I got really sick. And I can't open a can. I can't be around a can of nitrocellulose lacquer. Can't open it. A friend came, one of my guitar building students came. He was just finished a guitar, sprayed it in his garage, and he brought it by said, "I want you to look at the finish." And I didn't think about it. It had been curing in his garage for a while, hanging up, and he brought it in, and he wanted me to look, see, what do you think? It's finished. And I was holding it up, looking at it, and I that close to it, just the gassing off, and I just started to lose it. And I said, we got to go outside. And that night I had the most intense headache, gut pains, sweating. It was just horrible. I just can't be around that stuff. So I switched to water-based finish, and of which there's many waterborne finishes now. And I did that for quite a few years, and I never liked it much, but I was less sensitive to it. And then I slowly got sensitized to it. And I got to the point where if I wore enough gear, I could spray and not get sick. But I couldn't have them gassing off in the shop. I couldn't be around it. My process of rubbing out is very convoluted, and I would use micro mesh sandpaper and did it all by hand. Take me about 8 hours to do the final rub and polish for an instrument. And I would have to do it with a forced air respirator, breather on, in order to be able to not get sick. And after a while, I just said, I can't do this. What am I going to do? And I didn't want to use oil for the tops. I use oil for the back and sides, kind of an oil varnish, which I'm not that sensitive to. So I finally decided I needed to do French polish. And French polish doesn't bother me much. The alcohol is gassed off overnight. You can French polish, put on 5 or 8 or 10 coats in a day, and the next day the alcohol's gone. You don't smell it. But it has a little section of harp strings that start there and go up in pitch. And the pegs were here, but I had to redo stuff, it being a prototype, so I'm working on it. But essentially it's a banjo pot, and for this prototype I just used an old banjo pot I had, an old something from the last century. and making the neck and peghead. The other thing that's interesting about it is that it's 5-string banjo is typical. This has 6 strings, so it has an extra low string, which is really nice for. And I'm doing this with nylon strings right now, but the extra strings, the harp strings, will be metal strings. Eventually, I want to do something where I have some bass strings too, some harp bass strings. And I'm thinking it's something which will be kind of a crossover that harp guitarists, because I have clientele in the harp guitar community, will be interested in. And so I'd like to add some elements that are more similar to some of the harp guitars that are being made. My idea is that I'm going to actually make a few of these and make it something that's simple to construct and is enough like a 5-string banjo that 5-string banjoists could play it, but is interesting enough that some of the harp guitar people will be interested in it too. We'll see. There's the bird clock. You should be glad that we don't have one of the motorcycle clocks that makes a sound of vintage motorcycles every hour, or the train clocks. You could just tune them like a guitar and still have the thumb string. Yeah. I'm always trying to make the banjo warmer, and so here there's going to be 7 more pegs. I pulled them out. I had to redo this section for various reasons. There will be like this. 7 more pegs and 7 more of these thin high strings. The idea will be that then I could have this 5th string on the 5-string banjo is just hit by the thumb, and it's just droning, right? It's doing that all the time. But then you only have that one note to drone. So the idea was I could have a whole octave of notes to drone on if I can train my thumb to hit them, right? Then the other thing is that you can also pluck those and do other effects with them. Turns out they're really cool. Actually, when I had it strung up, it was just enchanting sounding, just really neat. Whether the world will like it or won't be something that the world wants. It's got a lot because it's so big and echoey and has all these strings. It's got quite an amazing presence.